let me introduce Gordon Laco. Gordon Laco served on the board of directors of Tall Ships America from 2015 to 2021 and currently sits on the board of Tall Ships Canada. He supports the operations of sail training ships and maintenance of classic yachts in every way he can. He began his career in the marine industry in 1979 after studying history at the University of Western Ontario, when he joined the staff of Toronto's Tom Taylor Company, following in the footsteps of his late uncle, Con Costas. Gord has long held respect for seamanship and an appreciation for traditional rigging. He began importing gear for sail training and museum ships in 1999 when he was captain of the HMSB, which Shellback has visited on one of its summer visits. The reproduction gunboat schooner operated by the Ontario government on the Upper Great Lakes. He began distributing rope and rigging across North America on a full-time basis in 2003, after returning from 8 months as lead technical advisor to the production of the feature film Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. He has served as an historical advisor in over 60 film and television productions, recently working with Tom Hanks on the production of the World War II drama Greyhound. Gord was co-founder of Atlantic Challenge Canada, served as executive director of the Toronto Brigantine, and has sat on the boards of Huronia Museum and Midland Public Library. Even though as a professional mariner, he dislikes shipwrecks, he also sits on the board of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. Gord is a frequent public speaker on issues involving seamanship, nautical history, and youth development. He served 11 years as an officer on the Royal Canadian Navy and was at the time of his commissioning, the oldest person to complete the RCN's tough basic officers training course. Congratulations, Gord, that's amazing. Core to his operation is his company, G.H. Laco and Son, which specializes in traditional gear for ships and yachts. He is proud that his son Robert has joined him in the business. When he has time, he races and cruises on the waters of Georgian Bay. This is the 9th or more time that Gord has spoken at Shellback's. And it's, I just let you know, he told us today that he's working on 2 new movies, but he can't tell us the names of them at this point. So please give Gord a warm Shellback welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for that very nice introduction. And I have something that I'll show you folks. I don't think I've ever shown you before. When my mother passed away a number of years ago, my brother and sister and I were going through her effects, and we found she'd kept a page from a desk calendar dated June of 1958. And there's scribbles on it, but you can see there's a child's sketch there, and that is a 74 gun ship of the line with 2 rows of gun ports. And Mom wrote on the back of that, drawn by Gordy, age 2 years 2 months. Where the heck did that come from? I guess I've always had an interest in naval history.
That's incredible.
So thank you, Mom, for saving that.
No kidding.
So thanks for having me aboard again, everybody. I'll just start off with an anecdote, as I like to do. The shanty that we sang at the beginning of this is one that I chose for one of the dinner scenes in Master and Commander. And what I did back 21 years ago was borrow the Shellback songbook, and I brought it with me to the set. And Russell Crowe and I chose that song, and you'll see them singing it at one of the dinner scenes after dinner when the port is passing around the table. And oh, didn't I have fun months later when the film was being translated into Spanish, Italian, French, and so on, German and Japanese, and for all the different nations it was being released in. trying to explain to the translators what sponger I and loader you means and so on. They were having a terrible time with that. And we all ended up almost weeping. We were laughing so hard as I was trying to explain those things to those people who were so earnestly trying to translate properly into their own languages. So that's another story. What I'm going to tell you about today is my own experiences with HMCS Oriole. Uh, as you'll learn shortly, I served aboard her in the Pacific Ocean when I was a junior officer in training, as many of us did in the service. But since I've reached compulsory retirement age, and boy, was I ever shocked that I thought they must have been referring to someone else. And David, I did point out to them that Admiral Cochrane served with distinction until he was 84, but they just said, very funny, Gord, and didn't let me continue in uniform. They've brought me back as a civilian with a grandiose 5-word title. Basically, what I serve as is the puppeteer for Oriole. That's how I describe myself. I work with the CO and with the ship schedulers, planning where she's going to go and what she's going to do each season. She's coming back to the Great Lakes next summer, and she will be in Toronto, and I'll be able to talk about more specifics about that as things develop, but that's late breaking news at this moment. So what I'm going to give you today is 2 stories that will come together very near the start. One is Oriole's story and one is mine. And once the 2 meet, I'll describe to you what it's like to sail aboard her. And I hope you find this interesting because I think we're all sailors here. And I hope that you fire questions at me at the end about what it's like to sail a vessel like that. That was once fairly common in the world, but now there's very few of them. So without further ado, I'm going to try to get the screen sharing going here. And there's my first slide. Can you all see that? I assume so.
Yes, we can.
Okay, right on. Here we go. HMCS Oriole, as you probably know, is the Royal Canadian Navy sail training vessel. Once upon a time, nearly every officer in the service went through her as part of their regular training. Now it's not that many, and it's not just officers, but she's very busy every year. Most navies in the world keep sailing vessels, and I'm going to discuss at the end why that is so. So Oriole began her life in 1921. I'm not going to do a lot of facts and figures because that's boring. I'll get to the interesting part as soon as I can. But this is a shot taken of her in Lake Ontario racing back in the 1920s. Sorry, the focus isn't perfect, but look at the mob of people out on her bowsprit handing a sail. She was a handful even then, and we have records that her rig was shortened by the Gord family shortly after she went into service. There is a mythology about that the rig was shortened because of the weight of the mainsail causing problems in the luff. That, of course, is nonsense. Oriole's big to us, but she's certainly not big in the terms of her day, and certainly not by sailing ship standards. Her rig was shortened to make her more manageable. She's not the only sailing vessel the Royal Canadian Navy's operated. This is HMCS Venture. She's a wooden schooner built, I believe, in Lunenburg in the 1930s, and she operated through the Depression years and into World War II as an officer training vessel. She's what we in those days would have called a turn schooner, TERN. They were used for light cargo carrying in the Maritimes of Canada. The Navy bought her in the 30s and sent her around to the Pacific, and she worked until she was worn out. I'm very proud to say that I went through HMCS Venture, not the sailing one, but the stone frigate that's ashore. Our Navy, like all other Commonwealth navies, carries on the old Royal Navy practice of naming shore installations and running them as if they're ships. We do refer to them as our ships, and that the anvil upon which our Navy forges officers on the West Coast when I came through was HMCS Venture, which is a complex of buildings just outside Esquimalt, rather closer to Victoria, at a place called Work Point. And I can tell you it's a very well-named place. We also had a yacht after World War II. This is HMCS Pickle, named for the famous schooner that brought the news home to England after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The glad tidings that the battle was won and England was saved from invasion, but also the sad news that the hero was dead. Lord Nelson had died of his fatal bullet wound. Pickle began her life as Hamburg, and that was her name. She was built for the Luftwaffe in the 1930s. She was just going into service when the war ramped up, so they never really used her much, and Canada was awarded her as a war prize. The story goes that her cradle was welded to the deck of HMCS Magnificent and an aircraft carrier, and she was brought across to Halifax, and we used her on the East Coast while Oriole worked on the West Coast right up until the 1980s. A very dear friend of mine who lives in Dartmouth now, who joined the Navy when I should have, when we were both the same age in 1979, he sailed aboard Pickle across the Atlantic in a transatlantic race, and they carried on back to the port of Hamburg, which was the first time she'd been there since she was taken away at the end of World War II. He told me that there was a fair bit of trepidation about how she'd be received, because basically she was taken from those people who loved her. But the welcome was very warm, and the theme of the speeches that happened at the dinners during her stay was that war is quite a foul thing, and it's much better that sailors get along when the way they should. Pickle served until 1984. My friend told me that she was a terrible leaker when they brought her across the Atlantic. He was very relieved when they got her home again. She was sold in 84. I think I saw her in Toronto when she was there briefly at Pier 6. And right now, rumor has it she's for sale again in New Brunswick. Unfortunately, somebody has sheathed her in fiberglass over her teak and oak planking, which often is the death knell for a vessel. But if somebody has unlimited deep pockets, boy, there's a beautiful, powerful yacht that needs saving. So back to HMCS Oriole. This is a shot of her in the Thousand Islands during World War II. The Goodham family first leased her and then sold her to the Royal Canadian Navy for a nominal symbolic amount. And she worked hard during the war years as a training vessel. You can see the mob of people on board her there. Oh, sorry. After the war, she was handed over to the Navy League, where she worked for naval cadets until about 1952. And she became commissioned in the Royal Canadian Navy as a proper vessel, and she remains that way today. And it was in the early 50s that she went to the Pacific coast. We were chatting at the beginning here, Graham and I, about how people on the Pacific coast of Canada are somewhat hurt that she's come back to the East Coast. But what I remind my colleagues in the Royal Canadian Navy is that she's actually come home. She's a Toronto girl, and people seem to have forgotten that, but we're very proud that she's back in her home waters each summer. So that's Oriole's story, arcing through to her life as a naval vessel. This is me 21 years ago on the set of Master and Commander. And can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, good. That is Peter Weir, the director of the movie. I'd like you all to take note of the expression on our director's face. There I am grinning obliviously, and this cameraman here is turned away from his screen saying, Gord, he wants you. And I was spending too much time posing for that photograph. My job was to be on the set every day and be ready for questions and to be proactive with them as well when required. Peter was a patrician gentleman. As I said, I think his was my 11th or 12th film, but it transformed my life. And one of the good things that came out of the 2 years I worked on Master and Commander was that the Royal Canadian Navy noticed me. I was invited to speak at HMCS York. David Mulholland, I believe you were there and said grace that night at the Battle of the Atlantic dinner. And Lieutenant Commander, oh goodness, I've forgotten his name now. The XO stood up at the end of my presentation about how I made the movie with everybody else I worked with. And he said, Gordon, I know two things about you because my wife's been talking to your wife. One thing is that you wish you joined the Navy in 1979 when you should have. And the other is, I know your age, you're not quite too old. I was 49 years old then. And Matt Davies said, if you're interested still, you're not quite too old. And if you want to go for a commission, we'll support it. And my wife and I had been talking just that spring that she commented, I suppose this is success, about the way the businesses were taking off. And I said, yes, sweetheart, it does seem that way, but to me, it just looks like a hell of a lot of work. And she said, you should do something this year you've always wanted to do. And we talked about going back to university for a graduate degree, but that seemed like a lot of work. We talked about doing a long sailing voyage, but the boys weren't grown up yet, and we didn't want to leave them behind or take them out of school. That night, I decided on the way home to Midland from Toronto, I really wished I'd joined the Navy. And the next morning, I called the recruiter and I started the process. So a hell of a lot of push-ups and yelling and marching went between a long-haired civilian to the person you see in that picture. But I ended up in the Navy, and it's something I was wished I'd done sooner. But for the 11 years that I wore the uniform, I was very proud that I did. So what the Navy didn't know when they took me on was that I had a long history in sailing vessels. I had been captain of HMSB, the schooner gunboat in the top left corner, for 5 years. And for several years, I had been executive director of Toronto Brigantine, who I know this group has supported very strongly through all the decades. And because of my involvement in sail training, I was a director of Tall Ships America, and I found myself at a dinner table talking with Lieutenant Commander White, who back in 2008 was captain of HMCS Oriole. And while chatting over drinks after dinner, he said to me, Gord, did you know that I'm doing the Swiftsure race? It'll be the last one while I'm in command. Why don't you come with us and maybe we can try to win? So I agreed to go sailing an Oriole, and that's where the two stories meet. The Swiftsure race starts in Victoria, and this is a bit of a schematic, and my goodness, my focus on that slide isn't good. I hope you can make it out. The long distance course for full-size vessels goes all the way out the Straits of Juan de Fuca to the Swiftsure Bank, which is where my cursor is circling here. Once upon a time, there was a lightship there. Now for the race, the Royal Canadian Navy stations a warship there, and the warship is the turning mark. It's a long race, pretty grueling, and we are all very excited to assemble aboard Oriole and sail in that race. I joined her full of absolute excitement. I could hardly contain myself. Of course, I'd been aware of Oriole all my life, but now I was joining her as one of her officers. And funny thing about the Navy, when I hopped off the plane in Victoria to go to Esquimalt to join her, everybody assumed I knew where to go. Well, Esquimalt's a pretty big base, and I found myself tramping all over with my duffel bag on my back before I found her. And I was very careful who I was asking, because as a newly minted officer, despite my advanced age, I didn't want to appear too much like the dummy that I was. So I met again Lieutenant Commander White, that's him, who welcomed me aboard. And he took me up to the bow where we could be alone together. And he said to me, hey, Gord, not speaking very informally, he said, look, he said, if you come aboard in your uniform as an acting sub-lieutenant, I guess I was a sub-lieutenant then, with intelligence, with the intelligence branch badge on your beret, everybody's going to assume you don't know your rear end from page 6. He said, I know you're a sailor and you've got experience. He said, if you don't mind wearing civilian clothes, you'll be here as the captain's buddy and I'll give you a watch. Well, I wore civilian clothes. So that's me with my arm around one of my colleagues who's the proper age for a junior officer that I'd gone through training with. He was borrowed from HMCS Yukon and to join Oriole, and he was in my watch on board the vessel. And as you can see there, I grew a beard when I joined, rather when I married Caroline. One night she said to me, I'll marry you, but there's 2 stipulations. One is no golf, because as a professional in the fashion industry, Caroline felt golf clothes are the epitome of bad taste. And the other thing was no beard, but she relented on the beard because we agreed it looked good with my uniform. So there I found myself standing aboard Oriole. She displaces just about 100 tons. She's just about 100 feet long. And if nobody sees any winches, that's because there ain't any winches. Everything's done by human manpower, and that's the whole point of her. She has 11,000 square feet of sail area. I wouldn't try to handle the few hundred square feet in my Alberg 30s rig without winches, but it was normal aboard Oriole and their systems to handle it. When I was still a civilian, I supplied a new rig to her through my business. Those are blocks that I had designed specially for her. And the pattern you see there is for her starboard side main running backstay. The purchase power in those tackles is absolutely immense. And again, with no winches, there's 4-to-1 in those wood shelled blocks. And if you look here where my cursor is circling, you can see there's 3-to-1. So that's 3 times what these blocks here are giving. You can put tremendous power on those just by manpower alone. And here's how you do that on her. They call it on board Oriole, getting aboard the sled. They all sit on the deck in a row, like in a bobsled, and heave that way from a sitting position. You can get a lot more traction on the deck. They talk about digging in with their toes. You can't, of course, in a teak deck, but that's how sheets are adjusted and halyards are tensioned and backstays are tensioned aboard Oriole. Down below decks, she's still the glorious yacht that she was when the Gooderham family owned her in the 20s and 30s. This is a view of her, I guess they would have called the main salon. We call it the officer's mess now. Behind this dark curtain here is the CO's cabin. He has that to himself. Behind this curtain here is the XO and coxswain. And this companionway leads up to about a midships on deck. I'll show you that when we're up on deck again. Behind me, there's still a fireplace. There was a piano, and there's the picture of the Queen on the wall, of course. King Charles is there now. And everything is as it would have been back in the glory days of a yacht. And I'm going to ask you folks all to turn up your sound as high as you can now. My primitive camera back in those days only took 8 or 10-second videos, but this is what the officer's wardroom of a happy ship looks and sounds like. If you remember the dinner scenes of in Master and Commander, well, this is the real thing. This is how officers that are working well together look and sound. So it's short, but that gives you an idea of the hub of the harmonious team that is the officer's mess of a well-run warship. She was my first since I joined the Navy. I saw regular warships after that, but that gives you a taste of what it's like. Oops, sorry. Going forward, where the cruise quarters are, Oriole is very different. She's like a submarine up there. You can still see the riveted steel construction from 1921 when she was first built. She has watertight doors, and quite incongruous are little signs all over her from the bad old days when the Navy was starved for funding, when Oriole was saved basically by officers who hid her from the accountants. If you were commanding a destroyer or a submarine or a frigate, and you were buying paint or electrical equipment or a watertight door, you might buy a little bit more and slide it over to Oriole. That made her look inexpensive to keep in the years when she might have been in danger. We're all very glad that happened, but you see little things around aboard her sometimes that look like they're from a much larger ship, and that's because they are. So in due course, we went out to the start of the Swiftsure race of 2008. And again, I'm giving you folks this talk on the assumption that we're all sailors here. And I hope we have good discussions after I finish the presentation about what she's actually like to sail. She glides like a witch. She's heavy, but once she gets moving, because she's so deep and narrow and heavy, she doesn't stop. And although the wind was fairly light at the start of the race, once we got her going at 2 or 3 knots, she seemed to make her own wind. And our challenge then was to keep weaving about in the fleet without running anybody over and without making any sudden turns that would cause her to lose momentum. That's how busy the start was. Oriole is in that picture. There you can see our Dodger there with her name on it. That's our mizzen mast. That's our mainmast. That's the mob of over 200 yachts that we were jousting with at the start of the race. A little bit exciting, oh yes, especially when sharks or Thunderbirds or CNC 27s and so on would dodge under our bowsprit, not realizing that we can't twitch out of the way like a regular yacht could. We didn't touch anybody and nobody touched us. So bang, away went the gun, the start sequences went, and the race started. The Swiftsure, it still is a very well-attended event. I believe they're over 60, it's been going for over 60 years now. And we started from just south of Victoria, in front of a roaring crowd on the shore who watched us all go in increasingly light air. The air got lighter and lighter and lighter, and soon we found ourselves beating to windward, barely able to keep steerage way up. But that was okay as long as the water was flat and we didn't have to make any sudden moves. We worked our way from the start here, if you can see my cursor circling, just off the city of Victoria. And it took all day to beat to windward across Royal Roads until we got to Race Rocks here. And at Race Rocks, darkness was falling and the tide turned. And of course, being a freshwater sailor, I wasn't used to racing with tides. And a few stalwart vessels tried taking long boards beating towards the American side of Juan de Fuca, but the tide was making in and they made no ground. So we saw their lights disappearing off into the dark. And when they came back, they'd either not made ground or lost ground. So with most of the fleet, we anchored and waited impatiently for the tide to turn. And the funny thing was, even if we were at anchor, we were overtaking the people that tried beating against the tidal current because they were being swept back up the straits. Sometime during the night, when I was in my bunk, I heard Oriole getting underway again. The decision had been made to give it a try. So she made one long tack across to the Port Angeles side, and I was fast asleep when we were coming back. But then things changed. Just before dawn, when I came up on watch, and I'm going to read you something at the end of this that I wrote on that day, Oriole was sailing fast. She was literally galloping, and it was all hands on deck when my watch came up to shorten sail. Cameras always flatten the water, but when this picture was taken, we were doing over 12 knots close reaching, overtaking everything hand over fist in sight. It was absolutely exhilarating. The power in that rig was something I'd never experienced before, even in a sail training ship. The coordination required is absolutely stupendous. Look at the size of that spinnaker pole at the lower part of the screen by that gentleman's foot. Everything's big and heavy on her. People could get hurt if you don't mind your business, but people mind their business, and we managed everything well. So we doused the big Yankee, we reefed the main, and we carried on under forestaysail, reached main, and full mizzen. Oriole seems to like that, although I squinted a bit when I saw it happening. I thought perhaps she'd carry a lot of helm, but she didn't. This is the hands up forward, getting the big Yankee jib down. The tack is out on the end of the bowsprit, and it was again, the camera flattens the water, but it was going underwater sometimes. We were sailing very fast. But about midday, somebody turned the fan off, and although you can still see there's waves out there with whitecaps, the wind literally stopped. And Oriole carried on for about another mile using just her momentum, but then we stopped their hobby horsing, plunging both ends of her under waves, and the whole fleet came up and passed us again. And the deadline for rounding the mark passed, and we had to dismiss ourselves from the race and head back to Victoria. So Lieutenant Commander White did not get his win on his last time as captain in the race, but it was a hell of an experience. And you can see with all hands hauling that big mainsail down, what an absolute giant she is with regards to sail. So in the intervening years, Oriole went through a huge comprehensive refit. She received new plating, she received a new teak deck, and more rigging, and she was basically renewed and launched back into the water as virtually a new vessel. The decision was made to bring her back to the Atlantic side of Canada. And in 2021, we had her in Toronto Harbor celebrating her 100th birthday. And what a moment that was when I was standing beside Brian Gooderham, and he sailed his great grandfather's yacht back up to the club where she used to sail when they owned her before they passed her on to the people of Canada. So Oriole is right at this moment in Halifax at her winter berth. She is coming back to the Great Lakes, as I said. And before I open the floor to your questions as sailors about what she's like to sail, I'd like to read you something that I wrote literally as soon as I came ashore in that race. I do this sometimes with films I've worked on or expeditions I've been on to try to capture the feeling that I've acquired in that event. In the early part of the Swiftsure race of 2008, HMCS Oriole was back in the fleet due to the light air, which was not much to her liking. But during the night, the wind came up, and by dawn, she was galloping hard in a fresh breeze, close reaching for the Pacific Ocean down Juan de Fuca Straits. When I woke from my watch before dawn, I knew everything had changed. The sliding silence of her light air creeping progress was replaced by an urgency that was felt as well as heard. I could hear shouting on deck, and my starboard side bunk's port light was deep underwater. There was an all-pervading deep vibration in Oriole. She was sailing fast and hard. We pulled our gear on. Up on deck, I found she was heeled over enough that her lee rail was dipping in the sea, which was rushing past like a river rapids. The press of her rig was driving her, and she was flinging literally tons of spray and solid water from her bows. Her port side bow wave was regularly flung quite high, tinted red by the running light on that side, and then hurled by the wind back over us. One by one, we overtook and passed all the yachts that had passed us in the light winds of the night. One might have expected those yachts to be unhappy about being caught, but they were not. Over the roar of the wind in her rig and the crashing of spray forward and in her wake, we could hear people cheering and shouting. We must have been quite a sight. It was obvious that the other yachts loved Oriole as much as we did. When my watch came on deck, I took my place at her wheel, steering for a while with the fellow I was relieving before he left. We had to shout to each other, although we were only a meter apart. "She really feels the wind, doesn't she?" he yelled. I grasped the spokes and felt the weight of the sea rushing under her deep rudder. For a moment, I was speechless, and then I shouted back, "Okay, I've got her." But we all knew she had us. And that, my friends, is why most militaries, most navies of the world keep sail training vessels. They teach you that working as a team, we're not just people, we're something greater than we are as individuals. And loving one's ship and loving one's shipmates that you work with is an experience like none other. And I was very glad that I experienced it aboard Oriole. So I'll put the screen back to me if I can do that. And there I think I am. And if any of you have questions about her, about what she's like to sail, I'd be glad to hear them. Well, I've got another story I'll tell you. When I first joined Oriole, she was in her berth at Esquimalt, and I was sitting in that noisy, cheerful, friendly officers' mess that I showed you the 8-second video clip of, and somebody said after supper, "Hey, let's watch a movie." So they ruffled through their deck of CDs, and someone pulled out Master and Commander. The movie came on, and we're all watching the movie. And while we're watching the film, someone said, "Hey, didn't somebody who just joined the service work on that movie?" And somebody else said, "Yeah, I think it was somebody who's just gone through HMCS Venture, and he's a junior officer now." "Oh, really? Who's that?" So they're all watching the credits as they were rolling at the end of the movie. And when my name went by, our captain, Lieutenant Commander White, he jumped up and he pointed at me, "You!" So that was very funny.
Can you hear me?
Just a moment. We have somebody else up first.
Okay.
Go ahead, Mike, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation, Gordon. Two things, actually. One of them was Pickle, because
Yes.
I sailed on Pickle and sailed against her in the 50s in Halifax when I
Wonderful.
was a teenager. And then she was painted white, not blue.
Ah.
So obviously, I don't know when that happened, but there were the East Coast also had two other vessels called Grilse and Tuna, which were about 40-foot sloops, and they, I think, had also been liberated from the Germans. But a question about Oriole, she was built in 1921. Was she originally gaff rigged? Because Marconi rigs were pretty rare that early.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Mike, she was originally Marconi rigged, and she was intended to be a state-of-the-art racing yacht, and she did have those jib-headed sails. And by the way, we still have a tuna. She's a CS-36 on the West Coast now.
Ah, right.
Okay, go ahead, Sherry. Sherry?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear me?
yes.
Oh, Gord, what exactly did you do in the film business? Was it out of Toronto? Because I was in the film business for 38 years. As a second AD for 10 years and then a location manager. My last was the location manager for 25 years. And were you in the Directors Guild?
No, I'm not. But although
What exactly, well, what was your position in the movie with you when you did it? Which is, I admire you. I think it's fantastic what you've done.
Well, thank you. I'm still going strong. They call me a technical advisor, and I work with the writers and the director in the various departments, locations as well.
Is that in Toronto?
Sometimes in Toronto, but usually far, far away.
Where do you live?
I live in Midland, but I go to Mexico or Baton Rouge or Los Angeles or wherever the film is being shot.
Well, there's a lot of filming going. As you know, the film business is booming in Toronto and also in the north.
My brother Norm Laco was a locations manager in Toronto.
What was his name?
Norman Laco.
No, I'd be honest, I don't lie, so I don't think I knew him.
Okay.
Well, here's an anecdote about my brother, and this is in going with Diane with your dedication on the land acknowledgement. My brother was a professional musician for 10 years before he became a locations manager, and he had a band called Surrender Dorothy. And one day, years after the term of the band, he was going camping on Christian Island with his girlfriend, wearing his Surrender Dorothy shirt. And as they went on the ferry to go over to the Ojibwe reservation on Christian Island, the young Ojibwe guy looked in the car and said, "Oh, are you with the band?" Well, my brother has dark hair and he had a tan, and but regardless, he assumed that this guy knew my brother's musical band, and he said yes. And they said, "Oh, no charge, come on. And by the way, there's a powwow happening on the beach. Join us tonight." So Norm went to the party on the beach, and people kept coming up to him and saying, "Do you know my uncle Bob over on Curve Lake?" Naming other reservations. They're trying to figure out who my brother was. And then he realized, oh, that band, the First Nations band. So when he told them, they all laughed so hard their faces hurt, he said.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Liz, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, two things. The first one is that what you wrote about that trip was extraordinary. I'm going to go because I'm on twice. And I'm in a black square and the video. I couldn't fix it. I'm assuming next time it'll work.
Oh, Liz, I couldn't make out most of what you said, except I think you paid me great compliments on what I wrote. So thank you for that.
And is the Oriole a ketch?
Yes, she's a ketch.
Good, I thought so. Yeah. Because a yawl mast is shorter.
That's right, shorter and aft of the rudder.
Rudder boost, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Well
Okay.
done. Gord.
Okay, next up is Michael Kane. Go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, you mentioned that the oil was coming back to Toronto. Is it going to be this summer or the following summer?
This summer.
This summer. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And will it be at the RCYC?
Yes, we'll visit RCYC and also the Waterfront Festival.
Ah, do you have a date on that?
That'll be in September, but we'll be in and about the area the latter part of the summer.
Great.
Okay.
Okay. Next up is Janet or Jacques. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
A little anecdote. We saw the Oriole this summer when it was in Midland, because we keep our boat up there. And we got on board and I was talking to this young fellow who was on the crew, and he was new to the Navy. He had never sailed in his life till he got this posting on the Oriole, and they brought it all the way up from Halifax. And he just said it was amazing. He is so glad he signed up for this tour.
Well, that's good. That's why we have her. And incidentally, some of you may have met Lieutenant Commander Drew Foran, who was her captain the first 2 times we brought her into the lakes just before COVID. He is now captain of HMCS Summerside off the coast of Africa, patrolling. So people do carry on in careers in regular warships before and after Oriole.
Okay. Next up is George. Go ahead and unmute.
I just wondered if she's coming back to Midland again this year.
I don't think we'll make it. I'm in Midland right now myself. I would love to have her here again, but I don't think we'll make it that far into the lakes this time. We've got commitments in the Maritimes in the first part of the summer, and I don't think we'll make it this far.
Because I'm on Bone Island and it's a quick jump over.
Oh, actually, we love going to Bone Island, and we regret the noisy motorboats that are there sometimes.
Well, we used to own the what sailors call Hockey Stick Bay. It's now called, we called it Long Bay,
right.
Or sorry, Deep Bay. But we've given it over to the parks.
Right. You must be familiar with the famous snapping turtle there.
Yes, we've encountered it quite a few times. We have never fed it.
No, we did once, and he didn't like the peanuts. He spat them out.
Okay. Thanks. Next up is Gord Martin. Go ahead.
Hello, Gord.
Okay, you hear me? Yeah, Gord, it's good to hear you talk again. You're a wonderful teller of tales.
Thank you.
And I know Gord through the Alberg Association. You were talking.
Oh, of course. Yes.
You were talking about how in the Swiftsure race that the boat was, I forget your terminology, but kind of surging. And I know that feeling from the Albergs. I mean, it's just fabulous. It's my drug of choice.
Yeah, she definitely has a groove, and when she's in it, you feel it.
Yep.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Any more questions? A couple more questions before we turn it back to Diane. Any more questions before we go back to Diane? Please raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll turn it back over to Diane.
Gord, I have a question. And maybe I missed it in what you were saying, but it sounds like you're sailing on this boat as it moves from place to place. Are you?
I wish. No, I'm the guy that arranges her ports before her, and every year there's a berth for me, but it's tough to get time to go aboard.
Sure, I can imagine with all the work you do. That is too bad, but I'm sure you squeeze it in if you can, even for one leg.
Well, here's a horrible story then, Diane. One of the ships my company looks after is Picton Castle, who does circumnavigations out of Lunenburg. Her captain, Dan Moreland, is a good friend, and he told me this winter, if I ever wanted to see Pitcairn's Island in Tahiti, I better come with them this year. And there's a berth for me if I want to go. So I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I said, you know, Caroline, to my wife, if I could take 3 months off to go sailing, I'd rather go with you and see Northern Georgian Bay and Lake Superior. So I didn't go with Picton Castle, and I guess maybe when I was 25 years old, I might have been desperate to do that, but I don't think I need to reef topsails 100 feet off the deck anymore.
Your point is well taken. That's a long way up. And getting, last time when we went out last summer with shellbacks on the brig, and we watched the kids climb those masts and climb up the ladders, the rope ladders, that's hard on the feet. Never mind the strength you need to do to get up there. Well,
Can I just say something?
Absolutely.
When you mentioned Georgian Bay, I was very lucky with friends to sail the North Channel. And it was absolutely, absolutely spectacular. Walking around those Benjamin Islands up there, it was amazing. And a very cute story was that there were about half a dozen boats moored, around there. And the anchors were dropped. And anyway, all of a sudden I saw this small, what do you call those animals that come from it came from an island, and it first came to our boat, and it was waiting for food. So of course I fed it, and it went to all the other boats, and everybody on the boats fed it, and then it went back to its own island. And it was just so precious and so adorable to watch that. I got such a kick out of it. I don't blame you for sailing just in the Georgian. It's just wonderful. Absolutely.
Why we live here.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions before we'll turn it back to Diane. Patricia or Aaron, go ahead. Unmute yourself. And ask Patricia or Aaron, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, is that better?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Gordon, first of all, my compliments. I've seen you out, not on the time. I've been out to the Swiss Shear. I've seen the Oriole go by. So it's a delight to have you reenact that situation. The Swiss Shear I was on was the same sort of thing. The wind quit and we died, and we didn't even get to Juan de Fuca. Yeah. But it was an exciting time. Now, you mentioned the start looked kind of interesting. The one time I was out there, the Swiss Shear was a downwind spinnaker start. So you could imagine that collection of boats heading downwind. It was a beautiful sight, but certainly challenging, and that was interesting. You did mention about going aloft, and I remember Alan Villiers' comment. He'd written articles about going in the sail. He, as a man, gave up going aloft when he could no longer do one-arm chin-ups.
Well, I'm finished then for sure.
And so I've never going to be able to go aloft. I've never done a one-arm chin up in my life, but that was the caliber of sailors of that era. Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Okay. Janet or Jack, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
What do you call your boat in Georgian Bay?
I named her Surprise for the frigate in Patrick O'Brien's books.
Oh, okay. And you're at Midland Bay Sailing Club?
Sailing Club, yes.
Okay. So we're at Bayport. We have a Catalina 400 called Monarch 2.
I'll watch for you. Actually, my boat's at Bayport for the winter.
Oh, is it? Okay. So we will look out for you. And George Hume, we stay away from hockey stick and all those bazillion power boats tying up. We go over to Longuisa instead.
Okay. Any more questions before we turn it back over to Diane to close out?
Okay, well, thank you again, Gord, for your 9th+ time with us. As always, you have done a fine presentation and just have our mouths watering to get aboard one of those ships, I'm sure. Coming up next week, we will be in